Gut, ja, ein herzliches Hallo.
Hello everybody.
Alle, die mir jetzt hier zuhören. Ich finde es wirklich sehr spannend. Letztes Jahr hatten wir
Very
auch schon
exciting
mal
to
ein
be here in this online event
Ich stelle mich erst
that we
mal
had last year too.
vor. Ich bin
My name is Hannelore Bettenhäußer. Come from Berlin.
Ich bin
I'm a wingwave coach.
Ich bin Wingwave
I'm a wingwave trainer for
2018
coaches.
für Finnland. Das liegt an meiner halbfinnischen Herkunft.
I've been that since 2018.
Ich bin seit
My mother was a
2019
Finn.
auch in Deutschland Wingwave
I'm now,
Trainerin.
and I'm a coach in Finland. I'm now also a coach in Germany. Have been since 2019.
Das heißt, von meiner Ausbildung her bin ich
My
Naturwissenschaftlerin.
first education was as a natural scientist.
Apotheker auf die Idee,
I'm a chemist, a pharmacist. How do pharmacists get the idea of doing emotions coaching? I realized very quickly that there's something missing in healthcare, and what was missing was wingwave or effective emotions coaching. And I've been doing that for a while. A few years ago, I worked with my friend Karin Schmidt, and we developed an in-depth wingwave seminar together entitled Wingwave and Transgenerational Influence. And this is what this talk is about. I will now share my screen. The mysterious influence of our ancestors on our lives. And it really is mysterious, because there's so many things we would never have guessed that our ancestors are still playing a role in our lives and have an important influence on us. Not necessarily that they want to do us any harm. I would like to tell you how Karin and I came to this subject of wingwave and transgenerational influence. How did we make this the theme of coaching? What led us to look at ancestors and then to offer an in-depth seminar in this? Because if I can tell you how we got the idea, then it becomes clearer how to use it and why it's important to look at the ancestors of a coachee when we're coaching. We worked together for many years. We coach each other. We tell each other a lot about our experiences in coaching, and what we often experienced that there were a lot of very stubborn themes that clients had. I'm sure you would confirm this. There's a theme that a client has that we work on, and the success of the coaching is sustainable for a time, but then after a while the theme comes back. Here's an example. I had a client who was afraid of heights. He could not even get up a ladder in his home, perhaps to change a light bulb or to put a nail in a wall. He couldn't get on a ladder because he was too afraid of heights. We worked on this. We did perhaps 2 sittings and it worked well.
Hannelore, du müsstest dein Mikro wieder anmachen, das ist gemutet.
So, ab wann, jetzt weiß ich natürlich nicht.
I don't know at what time you stopped hearing. I'll just repeat.
Ich einfach nochmal auf die Gefahr hin, dass ihr es jetzt zum zweiten Mal hört. Also wie Karin
How did Karin and I come to look at transgenerational influence? We noticed that there were lots of stubborn themes that clients had. Many of you will confirm this. So I'm working on a theme. It's quite successful. And yet a few weeks and a month or a few months later, the client comes back and says, it's better, but, and we notice that this theme has come back in a different guise. This is, of course, not what we intend. Here's an example. We have a client who was afraid of heights. He couldn't get on a ladder, so he couldn't change a light bulb or hammer a nail into the wall because he would have had to get onto a ladder. Or he couldn't get on a... We worked for this for 2 sittings and it worked well. And after a few weeks or months he came back and said, you know, I can just about get on a ladder, but I now can't drive over bridges. And I can't walk over bridges. I could perhaps crawl over on all 4s, but not on 2 legs. So we worked on this and it helped him. He could now go over a bridge alone. But the theme came back with the theme of elevators. And it was impossible for him to get into a lift and go up. And so we looked at his family tree and we found out which ancestors we needed to work with. I'll tell you about that later, how we do this. And we found out we had to look at his great-grandfather, who himself seemed to be afraid of heights. So the theme was not the ladder, not the bridge, not the elevator, but the great-grandfather.
Gehen wir mal kurz aus der Präsentation raus.
What are the themes that we treat when we do these coachings? These are things that accompany us as if they were part of us, but we wouldn't want them to be part of us. Inexplicable symptoms, emotions, play a role in our lives. There could be patterns of behavior that prevent us from doing something that we want to do or achieve. This could also be eating habits, which we can look at with coaching on ancestors. Also, obstructions of all kinds, negative beliefs that hinder us, patterns that are damaging to our finances or our partnerships, diffuse and unclear fears that we cannot define, and conflicts about loyalty and affiliation. Here's an example. Imagine the client has grown up in a family of craftsmen on both sides of the family. All of them are craftsmen. And he's quite happy with this. And yet the young man wants to then do higher education. And even if his family support him, he might then have a feeling of no longer belonging to his family. And we can look at this problem looking at ancestor coaching. It's important that we're always working with themes. We start with the clients themselves and see if there are obstructions with them. And if the same themes come back in different forms, then it's a good idea to look at ancestors, to see if there's something in the family that is being passed down from generation to generation. There are, of course, also good things that we can get from our ancestors. These are resources that give us strength. Perhaps everyone's heard someone say, you're as stubborn as your grandfather, you're as intelligent as your as your great-grandmother or something like that. Or maybe you've got that from your grandma. She used to do that exactly like you do. These are things that we can look at in coaching so that clients
benefit
from these positive things as well. Maybe all of you have some idea from your own families that now occurs to you. Things that are told in stories that are told in your families. The Bible says, I will bring the curse of a father's sins upon even the third and fourth generation. It's in the Bible, but we don't talk about God or guilt. But we do talk about these obstructions, these emotions that are given to us across the generations, and we would like our clients to become free of these old stories that have got something to do with their ancestors. So, to repeat, what could it be? Stubborn obstructions that come back again and again, like in examination or performance situations. They come up again and again in different situations. Then there are negative beliefs which prevent us from reaching our goals, such as I don't belong to my family, things like that. Perhaps it could be things like temper, fits of anger, panic attacks, things from previous generations. It could be an exaggerated wish for recognition. And if we notice that we're working on this theme and that it keeps coming back in a different form, then it's a good idea to look at your ancestors. There are also themes to do with affiliation. I don't belong to my family. If I perhaps violate some unwritten rules that are in the family, that are perhaps not even conscious, things that happen in families that are important to families, and perhaps the family doesn't really talk about these things, but they just do this. This is how it's done. I would like to present the background as to how we can imagine that our ancestors pass things on to us and we assume them. Most of us won't know very much about our great-grandparents, and perhaps even nothing. So we have to somehow explain and understand why we would still look at our ancestors, even though we don't know anything about them. There are three strategies. The first strategy is to tell stories and look at the stories that are told about grandpa, grandma, or your great-grandparents. These stories are often told very emotionally. I'm thinking of a client of Cora's who had become freelance and fulfilled her own dream, but since she'd set up her business, she didn't feel particularly good. Although everything looked okay and there didn't seem any external reasons for this, she had a series of panics, and in the coaching with Cora, they ended up with the grandpa, and the client said, I don't know what my grandfather's got to do with my work. But there was an experience with the grandfather. The grandfather had gone to a lake with his brother to swim. The brother had jumped into the water and never came back. He probably had a heart attack and he drowned. The grandfather told this story to his children, and you can imagine how, because he'd been there personally, and the children told this story to their own children, the grandchildren. And there was always a warning associated, and that is, don't jump into cold water when it's hot. And the client said to Cora, oh dear, that's exactly what I did. I jumped into cold water. This jump into cold water, given this background, was not so good for her. Didn't feel so good. And often it's the case that there are no stories told. If we look at our grandparents and great-grandparents, perhaps there was hard times. There was war, perhaps they were hungry, there was violence. And most people didn't say very much about this time. But there is still a way that we can find the information that is passed on to the next generation. And they are passed on through the mirror neurons, the activities of the mirror neurons. Let's imagine we have a client born in the year 1990. His mother was born in 1962 and his grandfather in the year 1934. Grandfather was growing up in Berlin and he experienced the bombing of Berlin. He had to continue to go down into the air raid shelter. As soon as the sirens were heard, he had to get into safety. And when he came out of the air raid shelter, there was always the fear that the houses had been destroyed. And he would hear the noises of the falling bombs and the detonations. He would hear explosions in the cellar. And these would have found their way into his emotional memory. Years later, there's peace in Germany. He experienced the war as a child and now has his own family. And then we've come across a situation at New Year's Eve where we have fireworks. And the sky becomes bright and colourful. Or maybe there's a thunderstorm in the summer and we hear the news of the thunder and the bright flashes of lightning. This is not actually the situation of a bombing, but the sound and the bright lights in the sky are associated with bombing. And so this reactivates his experience of the air raids. And now the boy of that time, now a grown man, didn't really feel great at New Year's Eve or when there were thunderstorms. He didn't talk about it. But our activities of our mirror neurons, which we all have, they become activated when we notice how someone feels. And we don't know that it's the fear of someone else, but it feels like our own fear. And this is active, and when we experience this, if we experience this frequently enough, as a child you experience that from your father as you're growing up, then we have learned something emotionally. Then imagine that the mother of our client, who was born in 1962 and never saw a war, she still has the same fear. She's inherited the fear of her father, of New Year's Eve or at a thunderstorm. And then she gets her own child when she's grown up. And this fear is developed in her own son. So it's a bit like a relay where this is passed on from grandfather to daughter to grandchild. And the fear of New Year's Eve was something that the grandson and daughter both had, although they had not had the same bad experience as their grandfather. There's books by the author Sabine Broder, which looks at the generation of the war children born in the 1940s. and with the grandchildren born in the 60s and 70s. She conducted interviews with these people, and it became apparent that the grandchildren were often afraid of things without apparent reason.
Sozusagen unbewusst über die Spiegelneuronenaktivitäten diese Ängste von der elterlichen Generation.
And these have been taken on through the mirror neurons from one generation to the next. This is not really explicable, because you can say I had a good childhood, I didn't experience the war. And so without that explanation, you can't explain it, and sometimes you think there's something wrong with you as a result. Whereas the parent or the grandparent is himself not afraid because he's repressed his fear. And this is one of the reasons why we said in coaching, if these things should be processed, then we need to test this very precisely in coaching and find the causes. There is a third way. And this third way is epigenetics. And I would now like to say something about epigenetics. Epigenetics is a recently developed field of research which goes back to the year 2000, when the human genome was decoded after a very big project. And people noticed that all the expectations of this were too big, and we saw that people had hundreds of thousands of genes. And then we realized there must be something else, because they looked at epigenetics. The field of epigenetics began to grow. It looks at phenomena and mechanisms that cause inherited changes to chromosomes and influences the activities of genes without changing the sequence of DNA. Put differently, this is the science that looks at the mechanisms of gene regulation or the influence of the environment on our genes, which for many years was considered completely out of the question. The idea was that our genes are our genes and they cannot be influenced. And that kind of like meant that we were not responsible. I read a book by a researcher who said the genes, the gene texts that we have, are like the keys of a piano, and the music depends who is sitting at the piano. Depends on who is sitting at the piano and playing it. And I also read an article which said epigenetics is the trainer of genes. Epigenetics is the more powerful and influential, the more developed the organism is. And that's why with human beings with 20,000 genes, epigenetics influences how these genes work together. And how does this take place? I'm going to take you on a journey into the human cell, because every cell has the same information as there is in the whole body, which is quite amazing. Imagine at the bottom you can see the DNA. Maybe you've seen this in school, these chains with these chains of DNA which contain information. And this information leaves the cell, leaves the core of the cell, and then becomes protein in another part of the cell.
dass die DNA nicht abgelesen wird.
But it could be that
Weil
DNA is
der
not
Körper
read
einen Mechanismus, eine Strategie hat,
because
das zu verhindern.
the body has developed a
Das sind
strategy
sogenannte Methylgruppen. Wir
to
müssen
stop
uns
this
heute
DNA being
merken,
read.
Methylgruppen
These are
sind einfach
methyl
kleine
groups,
Moleküle, die sich
small
auf so
molecules,
eine DNA-Struktur
which can be added onto the DNA
Wenn man
structure.
sich vorstellt, jetzt kommt die RNA und will
And then you
ablesen,
imagine that
dann
this is
steckt
the body
da
wants to
die
read this,
Methylgruppe,
and then there's a
dann
methyl
kann
on the
die
DNA
RNA
and it
nicht
cannot be
ablesen.
read.
Das ist so wie zwei Zahnräder, die ineinander greifen.
It's a bit like two
Einer
cogs of a
was
wheel,
dazwischen gesteckt hat,
and you put something between them and they can't work
ablesen
together.
oder mit dem aneinander
And they move
vorbeigreifen.
separately from each other without interlocking.
Genau das passiert mit den
And that's exactly what happens when methyl groups are added to DNA. And this prevents a gene from being read.
Und desto mehr ist es eben nicht möglich, dass dieser Bereich.
And that makes it impossible to read this area.
Ja. Nun muss man sich also vorstellen, es gibt also diese
So imagine there are these methyl groups. That's a strategy that prevents genes from being read. There are other strategies.
Man muss sich mal vorstellen, dass die DNA in jedem Zellkern die 2 Meter lang
So
ist.
in each core
Unvorstellbar, wenn man sich überlegt,
of a cell, DNA is actually about 2 meters long,
Also
which is not,
sie muss sehr,
so
sehr
it's extremely
sein, damit sie
compact,
wirklich dann in diesen Zellkern
so that it can fit into the core of a cell.
Passiert das? Na, das ist so ungefähr wie mit einem Kabel und einer
This is
Kabeltrommel.
wrapped in itself and together,
Auch
a
hier
bit like a
einmal
cable might be.
wirklich wie so eine Kabeltrommel aussehen. Und dann ist diese DNA da drauf.
DNA is wrapped onto a bit like a cable
Auf
drum.
der Kabeltrommel drauf sind, die also nicht abgerollt sind, auch nicht
And
ablesbar sind.
If it can't be unrolled, it can't be read.
Weil es ist schnell möglich, dass sozusagen die DNA abzurollen.
It has to be possible to
Sehr schnell möglich.
unroll it quickly and read it, but it's also just as possible to roll it back up quickly. This is another strategy that the body has. The second one, and the third one, which happens at the last moment, DNA has been read, and the DNA is about to produce protein structures in the cell. Then we get microRNA, which prevents the DNA from being read. Epigenetic markers are passed on when cells are split and passed on. It's like a memory of past events. Here's an example of the larvae of bees. All the larvae of bees have exactly the same genetic information. There is no difference. But through different foods, most of them become workers and just one becomes the queen. And this is only done through the nutrition. So the queen gets Gelée Royale and the worker bees just get pollen. Another example is a butterfly. The larvae of a butterfly has the same genetic information, but it's possible for it to transform into a butterfly. There was an experiment I'd like to explain. These experiments take place, I'm afraid, on animals, mainly on mice. And this is an example where a specific fear was passed on, and that was the fear of cherry blossoms. The smell of the scent of cherry blossoms was connected to electric shocks. Not very nice, but it's science. And then there were no electric shocks, but just the scent of the cherry blossoms, and the mice were still afraid. This is conditioning like in Pavlov's dogs. The mice then reproduced, and the next generations, all of them were afraid of cherry blossoms, although they had never had the same experience as the first generation. And this is a situation where a specific fear was passed down to the next generation. So how do we work when we're doing ancestors coaching? We never do it in the first sitting. The first thing we look at is the client in the present and the situation now. What are the themes that the client has? We use the myostatics test, and we do the work that is needed in the client now. Perhaps after 2 or 3 sittings, we're getting feedback that the assistance is not perfect, that things are not changing as desired, and then we can have a look at the family tree. And we look at the family tree. I'd like to cite a client of Karin's who said, he said he could never be happy about his successes. He wasn't happy with his success. He looked first at his own themes. It didn't convince him. It was helpful, but it wasn't great. He wasn't 100% convinced by this. And so we made a genogram, family tree, and using the myostatics test, we came up with the theme, I'm not allowed to be happy about my success. We tested it with him, with a myostatics test. It wasn't a stress theme. And we looked at both the father's and mother's side of the family and came to a great-grandfather. And so we used a timeline, which we like to use in this context. This is a format that we can use. We all have abstract idea of time as a line in our brains. When we think of the future or the past, what is ahead of us or behind us, we think of a line. So we can send people to the timeline of their ancestors. It doesn't mean they become their ancestors, but they can see where a stress factor of their great-grandfather has taken place. In this case, it was the great-grandfather. And the situation was summer, 30 degrees, very hot. And on the timeline of his grandfather, he suddenly began to be very, very cold. And even his teeth were chattering. And she used a wingwave intervention to dissolve this sense of being cold. And he said, that he was in pain and he didn't know where it came from. And for the first time he felt he could be happy about his successes. And she asked, what happened to your great-grandfather? And he said, I don't know, I have no idea. He never knew him. But he asked his grandfather. And we found out that his great-grandfather was a seaman and he'd lost a big toe to cold. It's hard to explain this, but this is not an exception, that a physical stress symptom like being cold or exhausted or a sense of burden on the body, we can often find an experience in the past, in an ancestor, in the timeline of an ancestor, which matches this. And after the intervention is over, we get feedback that things feel better.
trifft mich irgendwie, ist nicht mein Thema. Und gleichzeitig die Irritation.
At the same time, there's some confusion. Why? Why does it now feel better?
Also es ist schon sonderbar.
This is strange for clients who have been carrying this subject, this theme around with them for such a long time. Very strange that they feel better. So our ancestors do have something to tell us, often surprises. And so if there are themes that we seem to burden us for a long time, it's a good idea to look at your ancestors.
Nun ist das Thema Ahnen-Coaching nicht unbedingt ein Thema für ein Selbst.
And the theme of ancestor coaching is definitely a theme for self-coaching.
Tatsächlich handelt es sich in den allermeisten Fällen um sehr unbewusste.
Often, in most cases, it's unconscious themes that you cannot think of. But you can look at your family history and your ancestors. In many families, there are stories that are told about your grandpa, grandmother. For example, the jump into the cold water story. And there are other stories that the marriage perhaps of the grandparents was not particularly happy, or maybe comments that your mother has made about her parents-in-law. Perhaps there are particular images or pictures of your ancestors that you have in your mind. For example, I have a very specific image of my grandfather on the mother's side, who was a doctor, and he rode on a horse to see his patients. And I can see him sitting on this horse. And there are pictures in myself of my grandfather as a very serious man who has experienced a number of unpleasant things. And looking at the family tree, have a look at the pictures in your mind or the emotions that go through you as you're looking at the family tree, to which people in the family tree do have relationships, even if they're no longer alive. And then have a closer look at these ancestors. Perhaps have a look at the unpleasant feelings in your body. And then use wingwave music. As you know, you can get that from the Wingwave app. And listen to the Wingwave music. And have a look at your ancestor. And have a look. And maybe there'll be a surprise. Maybe be surprised by how your feelings change and how the feeling in your body shifts. And maybe at some point it stops being interesting to look at this and you become more neutral. This can be done very easily when you're on your own. And you can think of the stories that are told of your ancestors and work on yourself. Otherwise, it's a theme and a method which we use when there are very stubborn stories. Things that we cannot really let go of, things that keep coming up in our lives, things that we would like to be able to let go. And at the end of an ancestor coaching, then we add one more thing, and also look at which positive features of our ancestors we would like to be or have. And so we can reinforce positive emotions and use them for ourselves. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was clear, including the part about epigenetics.